In the second half of his book Punishing the Poor, Loïc Wacquant immediately asserts that the 1972 re-election of President Richard Nixon marked an era of social and racial revenge in response to the advances of the civil rights movement. Conservative politicians warned Americans about welfare addicts who were depleting state resources, and the penal state began to expand in order to control what Wacquant refers to as the black proletariat of the big cities. This new era marked the beginning of a trend where law enforcement officials focused on the visible delinquency of the lower class while ignoring white-collar crime, despite the fact that the latter form of crime has been found to be much more costly to society in terms of both dollars and human lives. The re-election of President Nixon also signified the beginning of a trend where drugs were treated as a public order and crime problem rather than as a public health challenge. Under Ronald Reagan's presidency, caste and class inequities deepened against a backdrop of deindustrialization and the erosion of unions. Also, officials began to substitute the welfare state with the prison state. This trend has not reversed itself, as prisons make up over 1/3 of the justice budget. Wacquant argues that Texas and California are two states with particularly intense interests in the penal sector. And he argues that Texas and California have spent more money on prisons than universities. In fact, in Texas, the correctional budget is 6 times that of the university budget. In California, over 8% of public expenditures have been devoted to constructing and managing penal facilities. The California Correctional Peace Officers Association is a powerful lobbying association, and it allocates twice as much money to political candidates as the California Teachers Union, despite the fact that the Teachers Union has 10 times as many members. Because of intense lobbying and due to a variety of other factors, the U.S. carceral system now employs 4 times as many people as McDonald's. Wacquant asserts that hyperinflation has limited the prospects of the poor. Research indicates that once an individual is incarcerated, he is substantially less likely to find a stable job or get married. Both of these are obviously ways to avoid becoming a criminal, yet incarceration greatly reduces these opportunities. The privatization of prison is also somewhat disturbing. Most of the time, carceral companies tend to be disproportionately in the South, especially private companies, is what I meant to say, with the first private prison being built in Tennessee. This may not be a coincidence. Immediately after the emancipation of former slaves, convict lease systems flourished in the South. Here, private enterprises flourished by managing prison labor. It is also worth noting that as soon as slaves were emancipated, almost immediately thousands of former slaves were arrested, tried, and turned into prisoners. African Americans were given a legal victory, yet white Southerners used the criminal justice system as a tool to undermine the abolition of slavery. The abolition of slavery. As a result, many former slaves found themselves doing essentially the same work prior to the abolition of slavery, only they were now prisoners. History tends to repeat itself, and today, after minorities achieved similar victories in the civil rights movement, the criminal justice system has once again been utilized in a discriminatory manner against minority men and African American men in particular. And once again, private enterprises are profiting from the imprisonment of racial minorities as they did during the time of convict leasing. I do not find it to be at all odd or coincidental that private prisons started in the South, and today I don't find it to be more prominent that they tend to be more likely to exist in the southern parts of the United States. Having said that, it is worth mentioning that the United Kingdom has also experimented with private prisons, although this is not a point that Wacquant makes in his book. It is important to note that Wacquant argues throughout his book that in the neoliberalism era, the government has scaled back social welfare programs and has replaced this with what he refers to as prison fare. Today, incarceration is the new Jim Crow. There are in fact many parallels between the current practices of mass incarceration of the racial minority and the former Jim Crow legal system. In both cases, legalized discrimination marginalizes and physically separates large segments of the African American community that are now in penal institutions and ghettos. And then it authorizes their inferior treatment in a number of fields. Also today, 1 in 6 African Americans is not permitted to vote due to a felony conviction. According to Wacquant, it is ironic that after the civil rights movement gave African Americans access to the voting booth, this is a right that has been taken back by the penal system. Wacquant also argues that once an inmate is released from prison, the formal discrimination and social stigmatization that follow prevent the former convict from reintegrating into the society and also back into his community to some extent. In large cities, rather than being able to fully go back in, they will sometimes have a difficulty, and as a result, many racial minorities will reside in urban ghettos, and Wacquant contends that even today the ghetto is a special device which is utilized in order to contain the descendants of former slaves. He even sees the ghetto as a type of ethno-racial prison which severely curtails the life chances of its residents. At the same time, he argues that the ghetto serves as an urban condom. And that's not his phrase, by the way, but it serves as an urban condom that protects mainstream society from individuals who are perceived to be dangerous. Also, Wacquant alludes to riots that have occurred within racialized ghettos in America, and he writes that as the ghetto walls have crumbled within racialized communities, prison walls are being built. And it is astounding to me that today 60% of African American men who do not graduate high school will spend at least some time behind bars during their lives. This is a national crisis that for the most part is not even being addressed by civil rights organizations. In a rather interesting chapter, Wacquant turns his attention to the sex offender. He argues that California is the first state which required sex offenders to register as early as 1947. Also, Wacquant discusses Megan's Law, which has kept sex offenders under constant scrutiny. He discusses the registration and notification process and argues that in some cases, judges can actually require sex offenders to wear distinctive items which identify themselves as sex offenders to the community. Wacquant also argues that some sex offenders will actually go into hiding in order to avoid the collateral consequences of registration. Also, he asserts that sex offender databases may actually result in more sex offenses. For example, a false sense of security may lower parents from being vigilant. If they think they know who all the sex offenders are, well, then they'll keep their guard down for people who they don't think are sex offenders. And we know that the vast majority of sex offenses go unreported and are unknown to the police. Also, and I think this is interesting, many sex offenders have been driven out of middle-class neighborhoods. This is important because they typically reside in lower-class housing, and as a result, there is a high concentration of sex offenses in poor areas. And this might actually result in more sex offenses committed against the poor who have less resources than middle class in order to actually protect their children from sex offenders. And this is problematic also because, again, individuals who are poor may not have the means to guard against sex offenses and other violent crimes in the first place. And this is not really a point that Wacquant makes in his book. However, it is certainly worth mentioning. Also in the neoliberal era, there is more pressure for both parents to work. The competitive work environment places more demands on the family, and as a result, there are more opportunity for children to go largely unmonitored and victimized. Wacquant argues that convicted sex offenders are actually less likely to recidivate than virtually all other types of offenders. And when sex offenders do recidivate, they very rarely tend to be arrested on a new sex charge. Of course, this flies against public opinion. Most laypersons assert that sex offenders cannot be cured, and as a result, many policymakers have responded to this by dismantling rehabilitation programs. This has been done in spite of the fact that hardly any evidence exists that sex offenders cannot be rehabilitated. Today, sex offender registries are employed, and this is done retroactively. In other words, if an individual committed a crime as early as 1970, he may still be retroactively put on the list and made to register. Wacquant also uses sex offender registries as a metaphor for carnival freak shows. He insinuates that one of today's pastimes is for people to get online and locate sex offenders who live in their neighborhoods. While Wacquant does not make this point in his book, I think it is worth mentioning that females are also registered sex offenders, although they comprise a very, very small part of the sex offender population. There's two supplemental articles, one of which I'm a co-author, which is one of the first studies, qualitative studies of female sex offender registrants. And very interestingly, my co-authors and I found that on more than one occasion in two different states, females were actually being forced to undergo treatment with male offenders, group treatment, because it's such a rare occurrence for females to sexually offend that it was just cheaper by the state to put them in groups with men, and it made for some very interesting and disturbing results, at least in this study that we came upon. We also found there were different types of female sex offenders, which is worth talking about, and that also some of the female sex offenders had different excuses or rationalizations or justifications in order to try and put the blame on someone else or excuse their behavior. And that was a very interesting research dilemma we had as far as how do we report this data. And then the second article is by Tewksbury and Levinson, and this talks about the stress experiences of family members who are registered by sex offenders. When you think about sex offenders being on the registry, you don't really realize the fact that they may have family members that are harassed, and their only crime is living with, a registered sex offender. And Wacquant also alludes to that in his book.